Hey, good, thanks. How are you?
Hi. Well, um, David, we don't have your video, but maybe that's how you want it.
I'm having a bad hair day.
But we can hear you.
Yeah, I don't have a camera at on my work computer.
Oh, okay. All right. That works. We don't need to see you. I don't mean that now. I mean that.
I'm doing you a favor.
I've seen you before. I haven't seen you. I wanted to get you guys together so we can go over the genetic testing results. Were you contacted by the lab at all? Just out of curiosity.
There was when I talked to your office, they said there was a note in the My chart, and I'm not able to log into that chart, so I didn't get it. It was sent to us earlier. I just didn't get that message because I'm not able to log into it. So, yeah, but I think they did try to get in touch with us.
Okay. Well, so the genetic testing actually did show. It did reveal a genetic cause for Collin's symptoms, right? So those symptoms being, the term that we use for adults and kids with his set of symptoms is ataxia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that ataxia is always thought to affect, there has to be some dysfunction, we think, at the level of the cerebellum, which is the back part of the brain. And there are certain kinds of inflammatory conditions, or you can have brain injury or stroke, or you can have these genetic conditions that sort of target that part of the brain for various reasons, right? And we were able to find something on his genetic testing that actually does show that he harbors a mutation in a gene where mutations are known to cause ataxia. Okay.
Okay.
It's not a common one. This is not one that I've seen before. Um, and so here, let me just show. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And just to sort of cut to the chase with this, the good news is that it's not a progressive disorder. So this is
Okay.
there are a lot of ataxia syndromes where typically kids get worse and worse and worse. Right. This is not a progressive disorder. This is what he has, but it shouldn't get worse per se.
Okay.
Um, Now, there's not a lot of we don't have a lot of years of experience with this necessarily, but in the people that they've been able to follow, including some adults, if you go back into their histories, it does not seem like their ataxia has gotten worse as they've gotten older. So that's important.
That's huge. Yeah.
But unfortunately, there is not a treatment or a cure for this. And I think we had talked about how the chances of finding something that was like easily treatable was very small.
Yeah.
So hopefully I had already set up that expectation with you guys going into the testing. But as it turns out, it's true. Like he does not have something where there's an easy fix for this.
Okay.
Okay. Now that's not to say that in the future something couldn't change, right? And
Yeah.
I think particularly with genetic disorders, there's so much changing. There's so much that's happened in the last couple of years, and I would imagine there's going to be a ton of progress in the next 20 years. But as of now, there's nothing. There's no particular intervention. Okay. So let me share my screen so I can show you the testing results. Just have to do this. Let's see. Share screen. Wait, that didn't work. Okay. Can you guys see this test report?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Do you need to blow it up a little bit?
It's good on my end.
I think I've got it too.
Okay. If you can't read any of this, wait. Let me just blow it up just a little bit.
Okay.
I don't want people to not see this. The better.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to go through the report. So GDX is the lab that we used. let's just confirm this is the right patient, correct? Collin Ryan, and that's his date of birth, February 24th, 2016. We collected this back in May, and it was reported in July, and it's a positive result. Here is the gene. So in this particular report, there's just one variant or abnormality. Sometimes there's multiples that we have to go through, but this just has one. And this is the actual gene. It's CAMTA1. And a lot of genes have very sort of mechanical names like this. And then as it turns out, the name of the disease is just CAMTA1 related disorder. So it tells you this is not something that's been around for very long, and they don't have a lot of numbers with it because there's no name with it. It's just this very sort of dry gene name, and the disorder is that gene disorder. So this mode of inheritance, so it's autosomal dominant. Okay, so do you remember recessive versus dominant genetic conditions? Right,
Yeah.
Dominant, you just need one abnormal copy. In a recessive condition, you need to have 2 abnormal copies of the gene. And with recessive conditions, you can have carriers, right? Because if you only have one abnormal copy, you don't have disease, but you're walking around with this. And then if you meet someone and have a child with them that also is a carrier of that same recessive gene mutation, then you have a 1 in 4 chance of baby having it. Now, with autosomal dominant disorders, right, being a carrier is a little more complicated than that because, if you have the mutation, then you should have manifestations of that disease, right? Because all you need is one bad copy, right? Now, it's a little more complicated than that because, as it turns out, there are some disorders where the mutation, 2 people can have the same mutation and have very different phenotypes, so they can have very different manifestations of disease. I'm not sure that I have read that in this particular disorder. I know that there's variability within, different mutations of that gene, right? So, when you have a disease from a particular gene mutation, there are, a lot of the times people will have different actual mutations, even though they're within that one gene, and then that will confer differences in sort of the severity and presentation of the disease, right? But then there are also diseases where 2 people will have the exact same mutation and they have just wildly different sort of presentations. And I'm not sure that this is actually one of those. The point of that is it's very unlikely that either mom or dad is carrying this, right? Because you guys are asymptomatic and you're adults, right? And he's presenting as a child, right? So you would think that y'all would have at least some degree of symptoms. Now, I think it's still worth testing just to make sure, right? Because that would then at least give you some anticipatory guidance towards like, okay, well, if you start noticing this, like, is this something that could be important? Part of me is also like, do I really want to know about that? Like, like if we can the testing's always going to be there, right? Okay. So I'm not saying that you have to get this testing because I wouldn't want to push that on anyone, but the lab should have testing available. So I don't use GeneDx as much as I use a couple of the other labs, and they all provide free carrier testing for parents when something like this is found with a child.
Okay.
It's also really important for them to know these kinds of things. So I will look into that, and so that's available for you guys. But think about whether you want that information or not. The other reason why this is important is if there are plans for other children, then you want to know, like, okay, do I have a 50-50 chance of this of passing this along to my next child? Okay. There's also the possibility. There's always also the possibility that that he is the first one, right? And it's sort of like, well, how does he have the mutation but mom and dad don't? If that's where the genes came from. Well, the mutation could have happened at any point after essentially an egg or a sperm is made, right? Because that's where his genes are really coming from there. And so if, let's say, there's a sperm that's made, and we all have, our genetic material is constantly breaking and constantly being repaired. That's just sort of how life works. The genetic material is actually really fragile. So if something breaks and doesn't get repaired right, and you get a mutation that's in there, well, it's just going to get passed down, right? Yeah. And so if that happens in a sperm, you test dad's fine, right? But that one sperm had that mutation, and then so the child would therefore have that. Same thing with an egg. Mm-hmm. And we always talk about eggs with this. I don't know if it's misogyny or we always seem to talk about eggs with this. And I think part of it is because eggs sit, right? Mm-hmm. Like you have all your eggs at a certain age, very early on, and then they just sit there. And while they're sitting there, we always think that time actually is where mutations can happen because things break and then you're trying to fix them, and that doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. So that's how a kiddo can have disease but the parents can be fine. Okay.
Can it
there's
happen?
Also the possibility that after the egg and the sperm came together, when it's just a single cell or a couple cells, at that point, if it's early on enough, where enough of the cells would have that mutation, if the mutation happens at that point, then that could get passed on to enough cells that you end up having disease. Okay.
Is it too soon to ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Could it happen from exposure to environmental things like chemicals or things of that nature?
No, because when you have a disorder like this, you're talking about this mutation being in most, if not all, of your cells. So I guess it could have happened from exposure if that exposure was from something that affected mom or dad, right, and then affected what we call the zygote, right? Like the egg or the sperm.
Okay.
But not necessarily to Collin.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right? If it's an exposure to Collin, you don't see it genetically. Mm-hmm. You just see it sort of as a clinical sort of syndrome or a set of symptoms.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the autosomal dominant. This is the actual variation, which is like this really confusing genetic speak for at what point in the gene, right? So a gene, we have 30,000 genes. Each of these genes is essentially a recipe for protein, and each of these recipes is thousands of base pairs long. So this is some kind of code that basically tells you where along the gene do you look to see where this one T got substituted for like a G or something, right? Okay. So that's what this is. I normally ignore this because it's beyond my level of understanding and what I need to know. Zygosity is, so if something is homozygous, that means that both sets of genes, right, what we think of as the maternal and the paternal, a copy of the gene in Collin, both of them are the same, or is it heterozygous, so they're different. And in this case, it's different because he has one mutated copy and then he has one copy that is normal. Okay? By the way, I shouldn't be using the term mutation anymore. We don't really use that because it's considered not appropriate. Yeah, so I know. So we use the term pathogenic variant. So that's what you'll see in the report. Pathogenic means disease-causing, right? Pathos is disease, genic is causing, right? So disease-causing, and the variant is just that it's a variation from the normal code. Because most of us, our genes are more or less exactly the same, which is why they make proteins that work, and that's how humans work, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have benign variants, and you can have pathogenic variants. Okay. It's unknown who this is inherited from because we never tested you guys. And then the classification is pathogenic variant. Some of the classifications will say, like I said, will be like, it's benign variant, and oftentimes we have variants of unknown significance, which is a whole other discussion, but this is not one of those. They then go into, so most of these reports will give you a bit of a summary of the gene, what it does, and what kind of disease and symptoms you can expect. Okay, and sometimes it's very simple, and sometimes there's like a huge range of different things. So in the short of it is CAMPA1 gene-related disorders cause non-progressive congenital ataxia. Some have problems with learning, right? So intellectual disability, and some do not. And that's one of those things at the age of 5, it's sort of, he is who he is. Like, we know what his learning is like, right? And honestly, whether if he is having learning difficulties, whether it's 100% from this gene, would he have had some regardless? Is it 50% from this? And that's hard to say. In general, with most kids that I see, if they have something that is associated with an increased risk for like intellectual disability, and the child does have some degree of intellectual disability, then I just assume that that's what it's from, right? So, this doesn't necessarily. So sometimes a genetic disorder will also point you in the direction of, oh, you better look for heart problems too, or you better look for liver problems too. But this doesn't do that. This is essentially a neurologic disorder. And neurologic disorders manifest with both motor problems, right? So his ataxia, but you can also have learning problems and behavior problems as well. It doesn't change how you treat any of those things, though, right? Everything's just treated symptomatically. And then he has, if and when the time comes that it's time for him to have kids, he has a 50-50 chance of passing this down.
Okay.
So that would be important for him to know.
Okay.
So do you guys have any questions about that?
No, I mean, I think, like you said, at 5 years old, we've seen a lot of that. Luckily, he's continued to progress, and there hasn't there aren't any really alarming issues with his ability to learn or anything like that at this point. So that's good news, I guess.
There are differences in sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well,
No, please.
there are going to be, and the teachers are telling us that there's different ways that he is going to process information. So thankfully, the education system is really helpful in meeting him where he's at. And so he does learn. It just has to be, I think every kid's this way. They learn better if they learn through their system. And so they're really good with understanding that, but they have brought to our attention the possible need for a behavioralist to look at him at school. And it's not because he's a terrible kid, it's just because the way that they're working through the discipline and teaching isn't working really with him. So they're just looking at finding a different way to do that, and I think that's going to be the story going forward, is we are probably going to have to look at different ways of reaching certain goals with him.
Okay. No, I think that's exactly the way to handle things. It's really just take symptoms as they come along and just manage them, and it's going to be the same as you would with any other kid.
Yeah.
Essentially, I think we just just have to be on the lookout for the fact that he's at a higher risk for having subtleties and like learning disabilities and behavior issues, and just sort of staying on top of that. I'm going to have my nurse email y'all a copy of this test report. Is that okay?
Sure,
That'd
please.
be great. Thank you.
I'm really happy to hear that it's not progressive. That's the biggest relief, because that was one of the variables that I was hoping to just find out that it isn't progressive. So that's great news.
No, I think, getting a diagnosis of a genetic disorder is rarely sort of a positive thing, right? I hate to frame it in that way, but yes, it is a big relief that it's not something progressive. And I think, especially going in knowing that we weren't hoping that it would just be something that would go away on its own.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's not progressive is the next best alternative. So, and we're done doing testing. Now you just focus on taking care of him and his symptoms, and not worrying about what could be causing this, and should you be doing something to prevent it or any of that kind of stuff. That's
Okay.
just kind of treat his symptoms now.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in terms of future follow-up and other testing, I don't think we need to get MRIs. I think we're done with that, right?
Okay.
Even if so potentially on MRIs in kids that have ataxia like this, sometimes you'll see that the back part of the brain, the cerebellum, can be smaller, or will have abnormal sort of signal within it. And to me, it's not worth looking because, again, it's not going to change anything that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully he won't have to get another MRI anytime. I think if we were to get one, it would be if he was having a new symptom and we need to look for something totally unrelated, which seems unlikely. So.
Okay.
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 All right. Did you guys have any questions about that? I hope that all made sense.
No,
Yeah.
it really did. I appreciate you taking the time and explaining everything to us.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Okay. Probably at some point you're gonna have to talk to him.
Uh-huh.
I don't have great advice. That's a hard thing to do, right? So the two pieces of advice that I always give families, though, when they talk to their kids about a diagnosis, so one, never lie. I know that sounds obvious to have to say, but it's tempting, right? Like,
Yeah.
no one wants to tell their child things like this, and often I've seen families really work around a real diagnosis. I'm like, well, you're gonna have to fess up at some point. It's gonna be an ugly situation. So you're never going to be faulted for being honest. Okay. No one ever says like, "Oh, my parents are honest with me about this when I was a kid." You know, it's always the
Yeah.
other way around. So
Yeah.
be honest. The other two is just make it developmentally appropriate. You know, talk to him like a 5-year-old, right?
Okay.
Put it in those terms. And 5-year-olds handle some big stuff, and so just sort of put it in that context for him.
So should we talk to him now about it or wait a little bit later?
I guess it would be different if you guys were like on an island by yourselves, and
Yeah.
he wasn't comparing himself to other kids.
Yeah.
As he gets older, the insight's going to develop, and he's going to start asking you questions, right? So there is a little bit of like, do you want to address it with him first before it starts building up because kids at school are asking, or
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to head it off before it becomes sort of an issue that someone else creates.
Okay.
So I would think that you would want to start the discussion with him first. It doesn't have to be like all at once, but I think you guys are probably the best people for him to hear from, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think 5, yeah. Right?
Yeah.
You can talk to him about this.
Okay. Yeah, kids at school are kind of relating to him a little bit differently right now. And so maybe it would give him some power to be able to kind of understand, why he's different in certain ways and just maybe be able to explain it to them so they can just get over it or like say, oh, okay, all right, and move on.
Sometimes when it's not an unknown anymore, it's sort of like, oh, okay, yeah. Like,
Yeah.
Let's move on now.
Yeah.
He is. He's extremely analytical, and
Yeah.
will probably ask us questions that we don't know the answers to. Just because once he decides he wants to learn about something, he goes all in. He does that with animals and things like that a lot. Like he can teach us a lot about animals and bugs and things that he's really into. So that's one thing that I think he and I both have to be prepared for. Is
Yeah.
he's not going to let us. Yeah, he's not going to let us have the easy way out. He's going to have lots of questions and want to know the real facts about it. So
Yeah, and I think that if you keep it at a level that is appropriate, which is, I mean, I don't know if you have to get into like genes.
Yeah.
And, like,
I mean, maybe eventually, yeah.
He might. He would
that's
understand
like,
it.
how your brain, what's the brain?
Yeah.
Yeah. You just gotta get to that point where what's the brain, and that he has this disorder that affected how his brain works, and that affects how he's able to move his body.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you can necessarily fix. Right? I don't know if that gets.
Yeah. I think he would get that. I really do.
Yeah.
And then he's going to say, what happened? And he'll say, how does it do that? And then he'll really, he just likes to dig. So he'll honestly get to the point where he'll want to do research with us probably and learn more about it. So.
And I have a feeling there'll be a lot of questions about, well, how does the brain control my arms? How does the brain control my legs? And then you can get an age-appropriate, neuroscience book, which is out there, and that would be fun.
Yeah.
That would be cool.
Absolutely.
That stuff,
Yeah.
He'd definitely be into it.
Yeah, no, I bet he would be. And then there may not be age-appropriate genetics books, but that's like another sort of mode of this is how the world works, and sort of like a learning opportunity for some of this stuff and how he fits into all that. So.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Well, I'm just glad it's not progressive.
Yes.
So that was the biggest load off. Yeah. So now we go from here.
Yes.
It's good.
Yes, yeah. And in a lot of ways, the discussion hasn't changed what you guys understand, and who he is.
Yeah.
It's just a name to sort of what we've been suspecting this whole point. But that's really
Yeah.
Okay.
cool. Okay.
Okay. All right.
So let's do a check-in in about 6 months.
Okay.
Just kind of see how things are going. We'll figure out what his real needs are, and we'll figure out how often you guys have to see me. The other kind of physician that may be helpful is a developmental pediatrician.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, if his motor his motor developmental needs are, if they're not as high, a developmental pediatrician may be more appropriate than I am.
Okay.
Just because a lot of the stuff that you guys are bringing up about learning and behavior and such, they're much better at managing.
Okay.
Now, if there are things like equipment needs or things related to his motor development, then that's something that I specialize in and help with. But if it's going to be mostly learning and behavior in school and such, then developmental pediatrician is going to be the best for that. There's 2 in town.
Okay.
They're both part of the medical school. One is Dr. Ravenscroft, and she has a nurse practitioner with her, Cordy Garcia, and they're both great. But they've been shorthanded for a long time. And they just hired someone, Dr. Tran, who used to be at Scott and White, and I always heard great things about her. Now she's over at the Dell Med School now.
Okay.
So hopefully their appointments are not as backed up.
Okay.
So I think that would be a good fit.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I really appreciate everything.
Of course. Let me know if you guys need anything. I'll have someone call you to schedule the 6-month appointment, and then try to get an appointment with the developmental pediatrician.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ohm.
Thank you. Bye-bye.